Hi everyone, my name's Adam Sealey. I'm an award-winning back pain specialist and osteopath, and today we're going to be talking about what to do if you injure yourself. So whether you pull a muscle or twist an ankle, you'll know what to do because it's your actions afterwards that determine whether an injury is going to get better quickly, get better slowly, or not get better at all. So a major part of the healing process essentially boils down to inflammation. Whether it's a stubbed toe or a pulled muscle, there's going to be a degree of inflammation involved. And inflammation is like a soup of different cells and molecules that help the body heal itself up. And there are 5 signs and symptoms of inflammation. There's redness, heat, swelling, loss of function, and pain. Unfortunately, too much inflammation can actually cause tissue damage and prevent the body from healing itself. And things like pain and loss of function in the long run can actually lead to more damage than good. So in essence, what we try to achieve is to take away the bad things of inflammation, encourage the good healing properties of inflammation, which is a tricky balance. So what can we do? Well, you might have come across the first aid acronym, which is RICE, which stands for rest, ice, compress, and elevate. And more recently, there's PRICE, where the P stands for protect. Now, although this is the go-to system for first aid, the evidence supporting it actually isn't very strong, but that's mostly because the studies that explore it aren't very well constructed, and so the evidence supporting it basically has to be thrown out the window. However, each individual component, so protect, rest, ice, compress, and elevate, have all been explored independently, and these have all been linked to faster recovery times. So starting with P, which stands for protect, is pretty obvious really. If you hurt yourself, you want to protect it from further injury. So just to think, if you were to catch your finger in a door, you'd grab it and you'd protect it. But on a grander level, if you were to twist an ankle and the next day you go for a run, you'd be subjecting it to more strain and you'd be aggravating it. But chances are the pain would stop you from running too far. That's why we have pain after all. It's a defense mechanism to stop us or protect us from hurting ourselves further. So on to rest, which also can stand for restricting activity. Now this is a little bit of an ambiguous term because rest can mean different things for different people. Generally speaking, if you hurt something, you want to rest it to avoid aggravating it. But rest, you can only do that for so long. Eventually, you're going to want to start using it again, and that movement will actually help aid in rehabilitation. So you don't want to rest it completely. So just taking a bad back as an example, initially it might be so bad, you just have to lay on your back for a solid 24 hours and you're resting it completely from everything. But a day or two later, you might be up and moving around. So although you're moving around more, you'll still be resting it from, say, long car journeys, gardening, going to the gym, things like that. And then maybe a week later, it's feeling almost back to normal, but again, you're still resting it from, say, doing heavy deadlifts at the gym. So resting is a relative term. People tend to get confused and think they mean just lay down and do nothing at all, but it might mean resting from certain things which might aggravate it. So again, it kind of comes down to common sense. I will come back to this point later though. Okay, so the I stands for ice, which is easily the most debated term. So the idea behind icing it is that when you apply something cold to the blood vessels, they constrict, they tighten, which limits the amount of inflammation into the area. And that's going to feel great for pain management, swelling and loss of function. Well, that will improve, but it will also reduce the capacity for a tissue to heal itself. After all, that's what inflammation does. So do we really want to be limiting inflammation? Will it actually slow down the healing process? So the jury is still out on this one, but there is a great study from 2016 that suggests that cryotherapy, which is applying ice, will have a beneficial effect on the inflammatory process without hindering tissue recovery, which is the most important part. I admit that this study was conducted on rats, okay, but it was a very high quality study and the results were pretty conclusive and they are applicable to humans. So on to compression. It refers to bandaging a damaged area or wearing those compression socks, that type of thing. And similar to ice, what it does, it prevents too much swelling by limiting the inflammation into the area. So for tissue recovery, it's important that fluid's able to enter the area, but it's also important that fluid could leave the area to take with it waste products. If there's too much swelling, it limits the amount of fluid that can travel in and out of the area, which is why we want to limit it. And obviously, if you've cut yourself, it's pretty obvious why we want to compress it. If you've ever cut your hand accidentally, first thing you do is you grab it to try and limit the amount of blood loss. Yeah. So on to elevation now. Very similar to compression, it limits swelling and bleeding. The idea is that you want to elevate the damaged area higher than the level of the heart. So if you've hurt your ankle, for instance, you want to lay on your back with your leg elevated, or if you've hurt your hand, your wrist, whatever it may be, your hand up through here. Again, you can apply a bit of compression to it to prevent the bleeding, and the elevation helps prevent the swelling and the bleeding together. Now, obviously, this is a little tricky if you've hurt your lower back and isn't going to really work. So I mentioned I wasn't quite done with rest. I did say that this was a bit of an ambiguous term as to how much rest is actually required. So this has been recently renamed as optimal load, which again is a little bit clearer, but is basically suggesting you want to have as much movement as necessary to allow or to encourage the area to heal itself, but not too much as to aggravate things. Again, this is still very difficult to know, but that's where people like me come in. We can offer advices and exercise and instructions about how to restore proper function after an injury. So when is a good time to seek out professional help? Well, just remember that this advice is for when you get those little bumps and those little strains that we all get from time to time. But if you've seriously hurt yourself, then you should talk to somebody. Please don't go at it alone. If you have an injury that's not showing any signs of getting better, or you're not confident about what you're doing, then absolutely talk to a professional. So I hope that all helps. If you have any other questions at all, please feel free to comment and I'll get back to them as quickly as I can. Otherwise, I will see you later.